Won Im Lee was a 71-year-old loving mother who lived with her daughter in Hwaseong-si, Gyeonggi-do, South Korea. On September 10, 1986, Lee went, as she always did, to the city of Suwon in order to sell her homegrown vegetables to the local community. Tragically, after leaving to make her living in town, she was never seen alive again. Later that day, when she failed to arrive home far past the expected time, her daughter reported her missing. 5 days later, on September 15th, at around 6:20 a.m., Lee's body was found among the rice fields, only 30 minutes away from her home. She was bound with her own clothing and had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Little did the police know that this would be only the very first of many killings by an unknown and cunning serial killer who would go on to terrorize South Korea for 5 years, from 1986 to 1991. The next murder was committed almost exactly a month later, on October 20th, 1986. This second murder would be the first inkling that the community at large had that they were dealing with killings of a serial nature. At around 2 p.m., the body of 25-year-old Hyung-suk Park-koo was found near a marriage counseling center in a farm in Hwaseong-si, Gyeonggi-do. The farm was only 4 kilometers from the scene of the first crime, and just like the first victim, Park-koo was raped and strangled with her own clothing. It wasn't until the third murder that police began to truly suspect that a serial killer was on the loose. On December 12, 1986, Chun Bon-kwon was raped and killed in the exact same manner as the earlier victims while she was returning from work. 2 days later, the body of a fourth victim, Kai-suk Lee, 23 years old, was found in a rice paddy field in Jeonmanyang, Hwaseong-si. Although 4 women had been killed within a span of 2 months, police did not have any leads to go off of. The next year, the bodies of Jin Young-hong, 19, and In-ju Park-koo, 29, were found on January 10, 1987 and May 2, 1987, respectively. Both women had been raped and strangled. Since it was raining at the time of the murder of Jin Young-hong, the police were able to secure a shoe print, 245 millimeters long, of the killer. The killer would then take a hiatus for more than a year, not killing again until September 7, 1988, when the body of 54-year-old Gi Soo-non was found. Just like in the previous killings, she too had been raped and strangled. On the same day, a sketch of the criminal was released. The sketch was based off of a bus driver of a bus that Gi Soo-non was traveling on. Investigators surmised that she had ridden the bus with her supposed murderer on the night she was killed. Then, only 9 days later, 14-year-old Sang-hee Park-koo's body would be found in her own room of her home in Cheongdong. She too had been raped and killed, but this time police had arrested a man named Sang Yo-yoon. Yoon had worked at a nearby repair center. Authorities had found strands of hair at the crime scene and had determined that the hair had come from a person with a blood type of B. There were also traces of metals found on her hair. Yoon's blood type was type B, and being a welder, police were sure that they had their man. Yoon was arrested and charged with the crime. While the modus operandi was completely different from the previous crimes, Yoon was interrogated and actually confessed to the murder, so he was sentenced to life in prison. Yoon would later appeal that the police had coerced him into confessing to the murders, but his appeal was denied by the courts, and he would spend the next 20 years in prison. While it seemed that the public was safe, as after the arrest of Yoon, the first 2 years and 2 months saw the public experiencing a much-needed break from the murderer's reign of terror, seemingly because the killer was behind bars. But tragically, the real killer would strike again. On November 15, 1990, 14-year-old Mi Jung Kim was returning home from school when her body was found. She too had been bound, raped, and strangled to death. The killer had also used a razor from Kim's pencil box to inflict the 38 lacerations on her chest. The last murder took place around 9 p.m. on the 3rd of April, 1991. A 69-year-old woman named Sun Sung Kwon, who was visiting her daughter's home, was discovered dead, sexually assaulted and strangled with her pantyhose on a mountain in Hwaseong. This would be the last known killing by the serial killer and rapist who was later called the Hwaseong serial killer. Authorities believe that Yoon was merely a copycat killer, and he remained behind bars for the murder of Sung-hee Park-woo. Yoon would serve about 20 years in prison and was released in 2009 on parole. Overall, 9 bodies of women were found over a period of 4 years. The ages of the victims ranging from 14 to 71. A huge investigation involving nearly 2 million police officers led to the checking into of over 20,000 suspects, with 40,000 individuals having had their fingerprints taken. 570 DNA samples as well as 180 hair samples were analyzed, but all of it produced very few clues. The forensic analysis gave the blood type of the assailant as B, but there was no technology in the late 1980s in Korea to make a DNA analysis possible. In all, 9 samples of blood gathered from the crime scenes were sent for analysis to Japan, but they didn't match any of the given suspects. The hunt for the killer became a national issue, but the police failed to achieve a significant breakthrough. Until it was lifted in July of 2015 by the National Assembly, the statute of limitations for murder in Korea was only 15 years. Meaning if a killer managed to escape the scrutiny of police for more than 15 years, even if found to be guilty, he could not be charged. The statute for the killings had expired on April 2, 2006. However, police records were still kept due to the significance of the case. In 2019, with advancements in DNA technology, forensic experts extracted DNA samples found at the crime scenes and submitted them into a DNA database. Soon, the DNA came back as having matched to another convicted felon named Chun Jae Lee. Lee was already in prison for the murder and rape of his sister-in-law in 1994. Lee was born on January 31, 1963, in Hwaseong. During his childhood, his sister drowned, and he was traumatized by it. He graduated from high school and joined the Korean Army in 1983. He served as a tank pilot until he was discharged on January 23, 1986. On September 26, 1989, Lee was arrested after he broke into a home in Gwangju, Suwon, wearing gloves and armed with weapons. The landlord found him inside the house and called police. He was sentenced to 1 year and 6 months in prison. In April of 1992, he married a bookkeeper and quit his job as a crane driver in March of 1993. His wife told police that he was an alcoholic and a violent husband and father who would physically abuse her and their son. His wife would eventually leave him. 2 years later, on January 13, 1994, he would invite his sister-in-law over to his home. He would then drug, sexually assault, and kill her. He then went to his father-in-law and offered to help him search for his daughter. She was reported as missing to the police, and her body would be found 2 days later. Lee would be arrested a few days after, and upon being interviewed by police, he asked them, quote, "How many years do you serve in prison for rape and murder?" He was sentenced to death for his sister-in-law's murder, but later the Supreme Court of South Korea reduced his sentence to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. In 2019, initially, after Lee's DNA matched with the Hwaseong killings, he was questioned by police, but denied any involvement. However, he would later confess to the killings. He confessed to the 10 Hwaseong slayings, including the copycat murder that Sang Yo-yoon was charged with, and 4 other murders that police had not linked to the Hwaseong murder spree. He also confessed to more than 30 rapes and attempted rapes. However, Lee could not be charged for the Hwaseong killings, as the statute of limitations for the murders had expired years before. Sang Yo-yoon was acquitted on November 2, 2020, after Lee appeared in court as a witness and confessed to the murders. It was found that Yoon had originally confessed under duress due to police brutality, a fact that he had claimed all along. Yoon had been innocent, but no one believed him. Lee is currently serving life in prison for the murder of his sister-in-law. Although he was not able to be charged for the 10-plus murders that he confessed to, investigating officers considered the case closed and officially solved after 33 years. Because technically South Korea remains at war with North Korea, as the 1950 to 1953 Korean War did not stop in favor of a peace treaty, but instead in the enforcement of an armistice, it is national law that all males must do about 2 years of military service. And while this law ensures the country always possesses a national defense which is strong and robust, some speculate that such mandatory military assignments may be harmful for those not actually mentally fit to serve. Whereas some conscripts leave their mandatory military service with tales of stress and strife, some never make it out alive, be it at the hands of the enemy or, even more tragically, at the hands of their friends. The chaos started on June 21, 2014, after Im To-pin, a 22-year-old conscript of the South Korean Army, who had previously been described as introverted, decided to upend his pent-up rage on innocent soldiers, his fellow brothers in arms. After previously complaining of immeasurable and irreversible stress suffered at the hands of fellow unit members in the form of what he called hazing, Senior 22nd Infantry Division Sergeant Im deserted his military unit by leaving his post. But this would be the least of his crimes, as Im quickly went from mere deserter to cold-blooded killer in a tragedy that stains the memories of countless South Koreans. In the aftermath of the attack, the Army reported to the media that Sergeant Im had been assigned to his outpost weekly guard duty, sometimes referred to as vigilance duty, from 2 p.m. to 7:55 p.m. that day. They stated that he was carrying his standard South Korean issue K2 rifle, as well as a grenade and 75 rounds of live ammunition, a typical weapon issuance for a soldier on this kind of post. Im was supposed to return his gun and grenade at the end of his shift, but he never went to the weaponry to do so. Roughly 20 minutes after his shift was over, at around 8:15 p.m., Im took the grenade that he had been issued while on duty and threw it towards his fellow infantrymen. It exploded, injuring those in its vicinity, but none fatally. He then fired his rifle at a fellow soldier who was posted at a 3-way street on the outpost's rear supply route. After the initial shooting and explosion, Im continued firing rapidly and indiscriminately at the fleeing soldiers. He then entered the barracks where he and his brothers in arms normally slept and lived together, and promptly fired on several more soldiers. 3 soldiers died outside the dormitory's doors and 2 were killed inside. Additionally, 2 of the soldiers wounded reportedly had serious and life-threatening injuries. In the brief but brutal melee, Im was reported as having fired approximately 10 bullets from his K2 rifle, killing 5 people, including soldiers and non-commissioned officers, and injuring 7 others in the process. Once word of Im's disappearance reached his superiors, the Ministry of National Defense created an accident task force in order to most effectively respond to what they considered a dangerous and developing situation. They did this because the threat of Im defecting to the north was high. Being so close to the border and also being what the North Korean government would see as an intelligence asset, the government sent out what is called a Jindo Dog Alert, a South Korean alert named after the Jindo dog. Jindo dogs were designated as South Koreans' 53rd national treasure in 1962, and later the breed was further protected by the passing of the Cultural Properties Protection Act. Currently, the proliferation of purebred Jindo dogs is controlled by the South Korean government. Fiercely loyal, the Jindo dog breed is seen by some as almost too dedicated to its owner. The Jindo dog alert system is enacted when a local threat situation occurs, such as when a North Korean armed spy or special forces member infiltrates the Republic of Korea, or in this case, when a deserter occurs in the unit. When a Jindo dog warning is issued, not only the military but also the police force is mobilized. Normally, 3 Jindo dogs are issued, and when the possibility of a threat situation is high, 2 Jindo dogs are issued, which then puts the military and police on an emergency alert. If it is determined that a threat situation has actually occurred, the highest level of alert, 1 Jindo dog, is issued, and the military and police conduct searches and battles in the area designated by the order, with other missions restricted and alerts to the surrounding communities issued. Less than 18 hours after the initial attack on the army base, in the afternoon hours of the next day, June 22, 2014, a gunfight took place right next to an elementary school. However, inexplicably, Sergeant Im was again able to evade the hands of the government officials tasked with finding him, with police admitting to the media by 11 p.m. that night that they were unfortunately unable to locate Sergeant Im. The next day, in an official announcement on June 23rd, the Ministry of National Defense reported that they had finally apprehended the gunman after a tense standoff with troops, and in doing so had foiled his attempt at taking his own life with the very gun he had used to shoot up the previous 2 locations. They captured him after an impasse occurring north of the civilian control access line, close to the demilitarized zone dividing the 2 Koreas. Im's last interaction as a free man occurred during what turned into a 24-hour standoff with military police. Im's own parents were brought to a forest about 6 miles from the border that South Korea shares with North Korea in an attempt to convince their son to safely surrender. In a heartfelt and desperate plea, Im's own father begged his son to give himself up peacefully and to stop the violence and strife. But against his own father's sage advice, Im shot himself in the abdomen and was then captured. Suffering from what authorities called a self-inflicted and non-fatal gunshot wound, Im was medically treated under police supervision before being remanded to military prison. In the aftermath of the murders, some looked towards Korea's own government as being somewhat responsible for the situation at hand. Previous incidents of violence in South Korea's military have also been linked to what some say is a culture of bullying, which creates or exacerbates conscripts' mental health problems. In 2013, several suicides by young conscripts were reported, and in another incident, a private was beaten to death by his superiors, an act that was covered up and only later uncovered by a watchdog group. A person in a position of power was later sentenced to 45 years in military prison for that crime, while 4 other soldiers were sentenced to 15 and 30 years to life for the killing of the conscript. There were previously additional murders of soldiers on base in 2011. It was also reported that 2 Special Forces soldiers had died after undergoing captivity training. Their deaths, apparently from suffocation, were preventable and ignited public outcry over what many say is a deadly and abusive environment. Im's shooting spree is South Korea's worst military act of violence since June of 2005, when a conscript similarly went on a shooting rampage and detonated a grenade, a tragedy that left 8 people dead and 2 additional soldiers seriously wounded. The government tasked a team of 48 military officers with finding out more information surrounding the motives of Sergeant Im and why he seemingly cracked one day after 6 hours on vigilance watch. Speaking with friends, family members, and colleagues of Sergeant Im, They desire to better understand the origin of such violence in hopes that they can stop it from happening again. In an investigatory article published by the Korean Herald, Im was reported as having taken a personality test in April of 2013. They reported that the files showed that Sergeant Im was classified as, quote, a grade A soldier, and because of these results, the psychiatric recommendation was that Sergeant Im was unfit for duty at a general outpost, and it was recommended that he be given, quote, special attention. But oddly enough, when later retested, this time in November of that same year, 2013, Im was classified as a, quote, B-grade soldier, able to carry out the GOP mission with which he was tasked, all the while still requiring what they called simply, quote, attention. After starting his mission in December of 2013, he was retested 4 months later, this time in March of 2014. He was analyzed and determined to have no remarkable issues pertaining to the mission. Less than 3 months later, this supposed healthy and fit soldier would claim the lives of 5 innocent men and wound another 7, too critically. These young soldiers were just doing their country proud in serving their time, and yet some paid the ultimate price. In a later report, officials classified the attack as a result of Sergeant Im's, quote, difficulties in adapting to military life. Under South Korea's mandatory military sentencing laws, a soldier who kills a superior faces the death penalty. As one of the men gunned down was a staff sergeant, the death penalty was sought after by the prosecution. In what appeared to be a gut-wrenching statement of remorse, however, one that no matter how heartfelt does not lessen the pain of those affected, the killer stated that he feels, quote, deeply sorry for the victims and their relatives. He goes on to say that he is, quote, overcome with remorse. A South Korean court-martial convicted Im to death. The Supreme Court upheld the death sentence passed on Im, who in February 2016 was 24 years old. After this last failure of legal appeal, Im became the 361st person on death row in South Korea. According to the Yonhap news agency, 45 of the 361 on death row are soldiers.